Hello, and welcome to the K9 Conservationists podcast, where we are positively obsessed with conservation detection dogs. Join us every other Thursday to talk about detection training, canine welfare, conservation biology, and everything in between. I'm Kayla Fratt, one of the three co-founders of K9 Conservationists. We train dogs to detect data for researchers, NGOs, and agencies. Today, I am going to start out with a quick shout out for my intern Bridget, who joined me through the Oregon State University Fisheries and Wildlife Internship Program, where the students can get class credit for doing internships. So she's been working independently with the dogs for about 4 hours a week, following training plans, including this really cool book about imprinting your detection dog in 15 days by Paul Bunker, who is today's guest. And Bridget has been thoughtful, attentive, and detail oriented, and it's been really cool to see how much my dogs have been progressing under her care as she's been training with them. So today, I'm really, really excited. We're going to have Paul Bunker back on the podcast, and we're talking about his new book, which I didn't even know you were working on until you announced that you had finished it. Um, so Paul, if anybody doesn't know who he is, I don't know what you've been doing, maybe buried under a rock. But Paul is the founder and principal of Chiron K9, and he's genuinely one of the kindest, most thoughtful, generous, and experienced people I've interacted with in the world of detection dogs and conservation dogs in particular. He's the author of Imprint Your Detection Dog in 15 Days and a brand new book that we're here to talk about, which is The Detection of Buried Targets by K9s. Paul, welcome back.
Hi, Kayla. Thank you very much for the introduction and everyone listening in.
Yeah, no, thank you again for coming on. I'm really excited. So let's start out with what are things that could be buried that you might have a detection dog looking for? That feels like a basic question, but I've never worked on a buried target.
Yeah, my background started with the military looking for IEDs and buried UXO, unexploded ordnance. And that's really where I learned a lot of these techniques. But moving into the conservation world and the environmental detection world, in oil spill, which I do a lot of, we find a lot of targets which have been buried either on beaches
Mm.
because of the actions of the tide. Within 24 hours, oil can be covered in sand and start to become buried. And then over time, it gets further and further down in depth in the beach environment. But it could be anything that's buried in the environment, invasive plants, orchid bulbs,
Mm-hmm.
um, hibernating reptiles. I mean, the list goes on really. And we're looking at things that are more naturalized in the environment, not something that's just dug a quick hole and covered itself for camouflage, but something that's been there several hours and into obviously years and or longer,
Mm-hmm.
and actually naturalized into the environment where the environment interacts with that target. And you need to train the dog specifically to find those targets when there's no disturbance present.
Yeah, that seems like a really important key. And I guess I did lie. We've had a couple scats that have been buried, either by cats that will bury their scats in leaf litter. And very occasionally in Alaska, we'll have a situation where a wolf scat has been in a muskeg for long enough that the moss has kind of grown up and over it. So it's not traditionally buried under soil, but there's like a full moss layer over it that you can kind of pry open and then find a scat. Yeah, and obviously I think the IEDs and the unexploded ordinances makes a ton of sense as a place to get started with this. Um, we touched on this a little bit, but do you want to expand a little bit more on your background and experience with buried hides?
Yeah, so when I started training, oh, 40 years ago, for off-leash detection, we would, same as everyone else, whether it was drugs or explosives, just dig a short, shallow hole, put our target in and cover it loosely with the soil and then work the dogs. And because in the military and a lot of agencies, there's a restriction on how long you can leave explosives because we use live explosives out in the environment. And typically it's less than 8 hours because you need to sign it out the bunker,
Right.
use it for training, clean it, sign it back in, etc. So we would bury these little caches and work our dogs 3 hours later maybe and think, great, we're working on buried hides. Well,
Hmm.
in 1999, I was given a special project for the Balkans where we would look for buried UXO. And these have been in the ground, unexploded ordnance. These have been in the ground for 8 years. And researching that topic, what I realized was just digging a hole and placing your target in and covering it loose with sand is not sufficient information for the canine to be successful.
Hmm.
Uh, I went to a couple of conferences, one in Slovenia, one in America, about this topic, read series of books from researchers and research papers, and started to develop protocols to actually train aged buried targets under the ground. It also taught me the interaction of target odor molecules with the environment, which is critical in success of finding buried targets. Fast forward then, I continued obviously my military career, even when I retired, coming over to the United States and training the military at both the military dog school and then special projects in North Carolina. And when I started my own company, Sharon K9, and moved more into environmental conservation work, I realized that the understanding of buried targets just wasn't in existence. People just didn't understand the importance of communicating to the dog effectively what a or what their buried target smells like and the influences. So I developed the workshop, which is very popular. And fortunately, it's taken me around the world delivering the workshop. It's been very successful with people following the protocols and having a lot of success in buried hides. And I decided it's time for a workbook.
Yeah.
So, um, February, I think it was, or January, I started writing the workbook, and then I think it took about 6 weeks in total after the proofreader and got it published.
Yeah, that's amazing. You are so amazingly productive once you set your mind to something. It's really impressive. And yeah, I know I've seen the buried hides. I've seen a snippet of that in action, and I've been staying in touch with one of our students who was at our K9 Conservationist retreat last fall in Bend, Oregon, who has been continuing to go forward with it and has sent me some really cool videos of how far they've gotten. It's been really exciting.
Yeah, I actually continued mentoring one of those people, and they're training their dog on truffles. And I've done quite a lot of truffle dogs with it now, and it's very successful in
Mhm.
training the dogs to detect underground truffles.
That's exciting. That's something I keep talking about doing while I'm in Oregon. Yeah, and I love that that's another thing that's also accessible to more people. I'm sure that's helpful for the book, and its sales, but also just that then there are more people who can access this because most of us are probably not going out and recreationally finding IEDs, but certainly going out and finding truffles or mushrooms can be pretty exciting.
Yeah.
So, okay, why I feel like it's intuitive that something that has been buried underground is going to be harder for your dog to find. But why is that? What kind of physically or chemically changes when something goes underground?
So we're looking at changes both in quality and quantity of the target odor. And quantity wise is based on the fact that instead of having open access to the air, we've now placed a filter over the top, and that filter is soil and vegetation, etc. The heavier molecules can be affected by that and actually can't filter through
Mm.
the soil structure and get to the surface. So straight away, we've changed the quality of the headspace, and that change can be significant, particularly with conservative dogs, pedantic dogs that are very specific in their headspace detection. They might smell that target underground and say, well, that's not exactly what you've been training me on, and actually dismiss it. So it can be a problem. The other thing is that quantity wise, less odor can reach the surface because there's only really two pathways it can get to the surface. When something is buried, it interacts with the soil, and it can be either bind to the particles of the soil itself, and they're stuck there then
Mhm.
until something physically moves them, or biodegradation, bacteria, etc., will actually eat those molecules. The other thing they can do is end up in cavities. And once they're in a cavity, they're bouncing around and they can't escape again unless something physically allows them to move out of that cavity. So the only way that molecules can get to the surface is something I call venting. This is where the molecules can make their way through natural crevices in the soil structure and get to the surface. And the other one is in the water. Now, if we think about water, we're talking about the water table, moisture content, rainfall, dew, that sort of thing. Water moves through the soil through capillary action
Mhm.
and also with interaction with the climatic conditions. So obviously, if there's been rainfall and then the sun comes out, it draws that moisture to the surface and the molecules come with it. The way the molecules interact with water is either they're dissolved within that water or the water physically can move particles to the surface. But either way, we've again changed quantity and quality of the target being presented at the surface. So the challenges are that our odor is changing constantly while it's buried. And also the presentation and the movement through the surface changes the way it's presented to the dog. Remembering that the majority of time, we train dogs on air scent only. We place our target out, there's a scent pool or a plume, and the dogs detect that and then locate the source by following that air scent. Well, when we bury something, we're remodeling a new behavior and saying that now your target is, like, I call it a footprint. It's formed into the surface structure. And some of it, sure, can break away from that surface structure. For
Right.
very small targets, it's in such small amounts that actually it dissipates into the air and is diluted to such a point the dogs can't detect it. So
Yeah.
we have to make the ground itself productive, and that footprint of odor is a productive source for the target underground. So there's a lot of influences there when we think about it, when we buried a target underground. And then different soil types obviously can have an interaction as well and change that whole profile again.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Because more or less, air is air when we're working with air scenting. They're the physical and chemical properties of our atmosphere are relatively consistent. But there's obviously all sorts of stuff with wind and temperature differentials and whatnot. But with soil, there are so many different subsets that could be covering what we're dealing with. Again, my examples of like leaf litter and moss are probably very different than like a tight, wet clay or silt, right?
Yeah, clay is obviously the biggest challenge. So when we grade soil up, when I grade soil for dog training purposes, we go from sand to loam to clay. And sand actually is one of the easiest ways for dogs to find a buried target because the sand molecules, the grains of sand, I should say, are very uneven. So when they butt together, it's not evenly. So there's natural gaps through the sand. So the headspace can actually move through those crevices and cracks and get to the surface. It also means any moisture entering into the sand or the water table from below, etc., through capillary action can move a lot easier through sand than it can through loam and through clay. With loam, you're looking at a smellier soil. Obviously, it's got vegetation in it, there's bacteria in it. So that has another influence because now not only do we have a soil that absorbs that odor, it'll hold most moisture, it'll hold more bacteria, which can interact with the molecules and actually eat them. Um, so we have a more smelly background odor as well with the ground. But then clay, that's a very tight bounding type of substance. And actually, they tightly, like bricks in a wall, they interact in a way that they overlap and they form very tight connections, which doesn't allow all the time necessarily, unless it dries out and forms cracks, doesn't allow that venting, that headspace to actually move freely through the substructure. So we're relying more there on the moisture content getting to the surface. As clay dries, as we know, it cracks and forms these crevices that odor can reach the surface.
Yeah.
So in the workbook, as you may have seen, I actually detail that when you train your dog, you should start with sand, then loam, and then clay. And there's a matrix based on time because the movement of molecules through sand is a lot quicker than through clay. And through the matrix in training, we actually have to extend the time that the target is under clay than we would under sand. Otherwise, there's no going to be no odor at the surface. And we can't expect a dog to find something when no odor has actually reached the surface. There's limitations in the dog's capabilities, and there's limitations in the ability of the molecules, the headspace, to actually get to the surface so the dog can stand a chance of detecting it.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, I love the breakdown of the different soil types. And I remember, I mean, it's been a couple years now since I've revisited the Detector Dogs and Scent Movement book by Tom Osterkamp. But in that book, they talk about partially about different soil types. And one of the other things I remember reading quite a bit about was, as you talked about, this movement of odor molecules by water and how that can kind of cause presentations at like the base of a hill, and things like that. So I imagine that's something that comes in partially in your training, but also in your search strategy as well. Is that something that the book touches on, or is it more on the training side in particular?
No, it's specifically on the training side and clearly communicating to the dog what its odor would smell like under the ground because
Yeah.
there's so many variables within the environment. And as you discussed, one of them is the slope of the ground, the water table underneath and the movement of the water table, vegetation on top, trees. It's not unusual that, particularly like in cadaver search,
Mm,
human remains, that the dog will respond at the base of a tree, even though the cadaver is several feet away from the tree. And part that is because I believe water is being moved by the roots towards the tree and then popping up at the surface at the base of the tree. Also, there's shelter from the wind, etc. So we have this natural interaction with the terrain, but there's so many variables there that my workbook just couldn't cope with all of them. Basically, it's there to say, hey, your dog's found a target. It's up to you to analyze where that target could be. And it can be meters away from where your dog responded. And that's the other thing with buried targets. The target odor doesn't necessarily pop up right above your target. It can move considerable distance based on if there's cracks and crevices and how they've laid out. If a rodent or something has burrowed down at an angle and then hit your target, then it's going to form like a chimney at the surface. And that was one of the things that we found in the Balkans would happen.
yeah.
And we were several meters from the target because what happened was some rodents, mice or something, had burrowed into the ground and then formed a tunnel. And obviously they'd hit the piece of UXO, which was metal, decided I'm not making a nest here,
Yeah.
and traveled out again. Well, our dogs were responding on the holes, the burrows. Um, and
Mm,
I was confused because the dogs were really good dogs, obviously. Why would they be concerned about critters? And one day we actually traced the hole and it went all the way to the UXO and realized, okay, the odor's just popping out like a chimney.
uh-huh.
Um, and we've had experiences of that in the past. But also the movement of the water table is going to take that diluted odor with it and pop it up at the base of a verge, at the base of a hill,
Mm.
at the base of a slope or further down. And again, your dog's going to respond and it's correct, but it's not at source. And it's for us to use our brains and actually work out, okay, what's the dog telling me that potentially my source is?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I know this was something we talked about. So I guess I lied again. I did do a little bit of buried stuff on the Black-footed ferret project back with a previous employer, and for that we would talk about, you've got the black-footed ferrets are living in these prairie dog towns that can be dozens or hundreds of interconnected holes and this underground system, and the odor from the ferrets could be popping up in any number of different ways, and they've got all these different interconnected cavities and crevices, and it was pretty dizzying to try to think about. And I know there's been some discussions. I was just at a dinner the other night where they were talking about the possibility of trying to map some of these tunnel systems for other purposes, but I'm sitting there thinking about the dog utility of that and just having the ability to understand any of that. Luckily with that ferret project in particular, if you're within a couple dozen meters, at least then what a home range, where you're going to set up your camera trap. Basically, it's it's still very useful, even if you can't pinpoint it. But I would imagine for the unexploded ordinances, you do kind of need to find it. Being within a couple meters does require then the human to finish the job.
Yeah, but and clearly that's a lot more safer than just um, bimbling through the area, as we would say in the UK. I don't know if
Mhm.
bimbling is a American term,
It's a
but
book.
also, yeah, area reduction, obviously reducing the size of an area down to a couple of meters is a lot better than saying, well, it's somewhere in this 50-meter square. Um,
Hmm.
so area reduction is something we
Still,
would use that for. Yeah.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, okay, so we've talked about water and water tables. We've talked about soil types. What are some other factors to consider with buried targets?
The target itself obviously is always going to be an influencer on what you're looking for. The age it's been in the environment, because the longer it's in the environment, the more it naturalizes, but potentially your footprint is obviously a lot better at the surface. Climatic conditions are going to have a big influence, particularly rain, because anything on the surface is going to be picked up and potentially move below the surface again. And we're waiting an hour or so after the sun is raised, because that's going to bring it back up to the surface. And then we're going to get some evaporation happening, and we're going to get a better opportunity to actually locate that target. Um, at depth is going to have an influence, soil type, as we spoke about. There's lots of different factors there where really the human should be the one having an understanding of the target, the environment, and climatic conditions and the terrain, is able to map out how they believe their target is being presented to the dog and then work the dog accordingly, but also understanding where their dog may respond and how the terrain, the climate, etc., is going to influence the actual target location. Some of this comes from analyzing what you're being presented to as information, but then some of this is going to come from the canine actually giving you that information in the field real time, and then you working with your dog to find where is my source or where potentially could it be. So just like any other target in any other context, we're looking at all those variables: climate, depth, age, um, and influences on the dog being able to encounter that odor and give you some sort of response.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And one of the things that again I remember from I think it was largely the Osterkamp book, but a couple other literature dives I've done on these sorts of things, realizing the degree to which the first thing you mentioned was the quality and characteristics of the target, and how TNT and C4 can have different reactions because of the weight of the molecules and how that all interacts differently. And I think we have the most of that sort of research about things like explosives because they are so important and there is more funding behind those sorts of things. And every time I read anything about that, and then I think about, okay, so what does that mean for a wolf scat? What does that mean for a bat carcass? Um, we just don't know a lot of that in the conservation dog world nearly as well. But that's, I think, maybe this is a plug for if you're interested in something that is going to be buried. Obviously, Paul is a great resource, but also finding other people who are maybe working on that sort of project and see what they have been able to see as far as how that odor tends to behave. Um, I think turtle nests are probably one of the most common within the conservation dog world, but there are plenty of other aspects that, again, we might not know much about the actual molecular weight of what your target odor is, but you can talk to other people and start learning from them and from the experiences that they have had with their dogs.
Yeah, and in the workbook, the matrix for the buried targets in different soil types, I do talk about really you're going to have to take your target and go through the matrix and see where's the point of failure. And by failure, I'm not talking in a negative way. I'm talking where is the point that my dog cannot detect this target based on depth or age or anything. And I talk about it's best to train your dog in the all clear if you can, because that's got obviously going to reduce your frustration, etc., in the canine while you learn this information. Because in the conservation and environmental work, in a lot of cases, we don't have the templates available for us to understand what our target will do in all the conditions we may encounter it. As you said, there's been plenty of research in the UXO and explosives buried field, and there's plenty of information out there that actually reinforce the detection with those canines. But in our world, that doesn't exist. And in a lot of cases, it's down to us, the
Mhm.
people that are actually training and working these dogs, to find those limitations and then actually build on that. And I either see, okay, can I train this limitation and increase or enhance the capability of my canine? Or we met the point where it's too deep, it's too old,
Mhm.
it hasn't been buried long enough, that detection can exist, because it's not going to happen all the time. And we have to understand that.
Yeah.
I think people stress themselves out too much necessarily, that my dog must find it, must find it. But we have to remember there's got to be a limitation at some point in the dog's capability. As good as they are and as good as we want them to be, we can't push them into locating something that doesn't exist molecularly for them to be able to detect it. And amazing as they are, there are limitations. So again, in the workbook, I talk about giving your dog the tool of the all clear and then
Mhm.
test your target, see
Yeah.
where the limitations are, and write that into your SOP, or capabilities and limitations, as we call them, and brief accordingly to your client and let them know that potentially they would have to use a second method to back up the canine. I mean, obviously, we know the dogs are going to generally perform way better than any other technology that's out there, even humans. But if there are limitations, we can mitigate that as a team, and the team is successful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wholly agree that I think a lot of people get very concerned about what their dogs are missing. And sometimes, I mean, one of the things that I really admire about you and Dr. Hall and a couple of the other people in the field who are really good about this is also getting curious about the times where your dog is maybe outperforming expectations and trying to figure out why that may be, because I think it can be really easy to be so excited that your dog is doing really well in training and then think that it means that you've got the best dog in the world or the best training plan in the world, when in reality it might mean that actually might be a reason to be concerned that you're not setting up your training in a way and you're not training exactly what you think you are. I believe it was you and Dr. Hall who had the fabulous example of the different cap manufacturers or cap colors that ended up being part.
Colors.
Yeah, do you want to tell that story? We've told it before on the podcast, but it's so important and so evocative.
Yeah, it was in the olfactometer, which is the odor device we use in research that Dr. Hall developed. Um, and there's three ports in the front with a screen, so the dogs cannot see into the mechanism behind. It's protected from the dogs. Behind each port, there's 6 vials. So that's 18 vials in total. And they're connected via pipes and valves, etc., that and a computer that delivers odor to the port randomly, computer driven, so it's double blind to us,
Mhm.
and then the dog reacts accordingly. So we have these vials, and we purchased the vials from the same manufacturer, same company, except Dr. Hall's arrived and they had a black lid, and mine arrived and they had a white lid. And their scepter, which is the lids where you can push, um, if you were using it with injections or something,
Oh,
push the needle through and draw.
mhm,
But we make holes in the scepter membrane and actually push the TATP, the Teflon pipe, through to take the air out. So they were exactly the same.
mhm,
Um, but Dr. Hall had placed the targets in his vials that he'd brought down with black lids, and I had a bunch of white ones that I prepared with distractors, etc. What we realized, or what Dr. Hall recognized, was the dogs were too good, because we were looking for Vellingers,
mhm,
uh, invasive muscle eggs that are microscopic. You have to use an electronic microscope to see them in water. And the dogs were going down to incredible levels. Said, well, this isn't right. And we changed the vials out. And what we realized, the only variable was the color of the cap. Even though They were out of sight completely from the dog, so it wasn't visual. They're from the same manufacturer, from the same supplier, in the
Mhm.
same cardboard box, that everything was the same. It's just the cap color that the dogs were
Yeah.
responding to. And only last week, I was consulting on a special project down in Colombia. And on day one, I recognized the dog was being too good. The target was very difficult. It was a very trace small amount of target. The dog was showing check paces from a meter away, so 3 feet away. And I thought, no, something's not right here. And when we investigated down with all our little tests to see what the dog was really responding on, it wasn't the target. It was something associated with the storage and handling of the target. And then we were able to clarify the very next day what the
Yeah.
target was. But this happens a lot, to be honest. I see this a lot where, people just don't think about handling and storage to the degree that the dogs will cheat. They're not cheating.
Yeah.
They're doing exactly what we've reinforced them to do and taught them to do, but they're going to take the easiest shortcut to get their piece of
Yeah.
cheese or a ball. Um, and as you said, we have to constantly question and constantly test our dogs to ensure that it is the pure target they're looking for and not something we've associated with the target.
Yeah.
And that kind of segues into disturbance. And I think I'll talk about that quickly because, as I said, when we started this, we dug a little hole, put our explosives in, covered it up, and we thought we were training buried odor. Um, Fast forward several years after I'd learned about the buried UXO and the problems with that, I was on a program where they would train buried odor. They would take explosives out of the bunker in the morning. They would dig the little cat holes, place the target in, and then they would dig dummy holes in the environment to say, well, the dog's not responding on the disturbance. But I recognized very quickly that what the dogs were doing was covering the area off leash and then going to a piece of disturbance, sniffing it, going to the next piece of disturbance, sniffing it, and then eventually going to a piece of disturbance. And in a lot of cases, they would actually paw the top and then respond. And these were passive response dogs. And what I realized was actually you're training the dogs to look for the odor of disturbance as their primary source. And then they're discriminating, does this disturbance contain my target? And the pouring was just increasing that venting to the surface because it hadn't been out long. And that's when I realized, well, you can't just dig dummy holes because you're making that the primary source of odor.
Hmm.
And oftentimes on my workshops, I'll actually core sample a piece of ground and let people smell it and just smell the difference between the surface odor and what the smell is the ground underneath. And that's what all those gases, all those insects, all that rotting vegetation, you're releasing that into the environment. And of course, the dogs are going to find that easier. You're going to pair that with your target, and they're likely to find my target. So I just look for that primary odor and then look for the secondary. And again, that reinforces why these techniques of training dogs effectively on buried targets cannot rely on just digging a hole.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. And I mean, it sounds to me like it would be very easy to kind of accidentally train the dogs to do something. Yeah, I mean, exactly what you're saying. Yeah, I don't need to reiterate anything, actually. That makes a lot of sense. So when we're thinking about factors for success within, a buried target team, obviously we need to be diligent, we need to be good trainers, we need to pay attention to detail, we need to buy the workbook. What do we see as far as factors for success within the dogs or the handlers or anything like that? And obviously, I know we haven't necessarily done a study here, but have you seen anything that aligns with success or kind of factors that seem to run people into trouble?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that we need to consider here. First is, as I keep repeating, clear communication of your target odor within the context of what you expect them to find in the environment is critical. I mean, we can't work a dog unless we pre-arm them with an understanding of how their target is going to be presented in real life. And the workbook takes people from zero to hero in very meticulous steps, just like a lot of my training is, as it's been described, a bit intense. But the reason for that intensity is to ensure our dogs are successful. And when they get into the field, they are confident. They understand what their target odor is being presented like, and then can react accordingly. So that's the first thing, communicating the odor. For the human, the success is obviously working your dog based on the environment, the terrain, your target, and how you think you can introduce your dog into areas where potentially it's going to detect its odor. And that's very important. Obviously, as we discussed, it must get its nose to the point where some source is available. But also, one of the critical things you must understand is your dog is not always going to give you a trained final response, particularly with buried targets. You're going to have to look for that change in behavior, and you're going to have to act accordingly, and don't rely on a trained final response. Sometimes in buried targets, even the most passive dog will paw the surface. It happens. Don't get upset. One, it gives you an indication of where the target is within the environment, but two, it gives you information that you need to work on in training. And again, during the workbook, I talk about this, that in the early stages of introducing buried targets, don't worry if your dog paws. That'll come as a secondary. The first thing is, don't make your target odor a negative by correcting the pawing, because now we can influence the dog's acquisition of target odor within the environment because you've made it a negative. Just accept, okay, it's not ideal. I'm going to reward the dog for finding a very difficult target. And now I'm going to go back a few steps and work on the pawing as a separate problem and build it back up again. And then obviously, once the dog has give you that information, as the human, you really need to think. You need to think, where is my source? And sometimes it's directly below where your dog has responded. On the beaches that we were doing all these surveys for 3 years, under the hot sand, generally the target was immediately below or within 6 inches, 18 centimeters of where Poppy would respond. So fairly close. But if we're looking at clay or something, or even loamy ground that's very old, we may have to start thinking in detail, where could the target be? And we're actually going through something at the minute. It's a cadaver case, human remains. It's several years old, where it's believed there are a couple of bodies in an environment which has a free-flowing water table, underground river, basically, a slope, and it was a former quarry. So it's got lots of rock and limestone, etc. And the K9s have been given responses, and Andrea Pinter and I have been asked to consult and actually work out where could the location of the bodies be, because the K9s are given responses, but there's so many influences there on those buried targets that it's not easy to actually locate the source, and to try and tie that down takes humans. It takes an understanding of the geology, and they brought in geologists to actually look at, or I think they're called geologists, but look at the flow of the underground river, and the movement in the terrain, etc., to try and pinpoint the location. But it's a team event, and I talk about that quite a lot. The dog can give you so much information, but you have to do your part as well.
Yeah. No, that sounds like a fascinating case, and very much so illustrates how complicated this can be. I'm imagining, I recently joined the there's a fluid dynamics club within the physics department on campus at OSU. And it's largely, undergrads who are planning on getting into wastewater management and those sorts of things. But I can imagine that sounds like the sort of puzzle that would come up on a final exam for those sorts of students. Yeah, that's fascinating. So, okay, I think we've got just two more questions here as we're wrapping up. So, are there any common pitfalls you've seen in students or people in your workshops? Like, what are that we haven't mentioned so far? What causes people to get hung up?
Well, with my workshops, they're also very step from basic through to imprinted on target odor. And I actually take people through those steps very carefully to ensure that we are communicating correctly. And I know sometimes people will want to rush the process, and get to the end goal. And I talk about this so many times about Atomic Habits by James Clear,
Yeah.
how trust the process. If you invest in the process, you're going to reach the end goal. But if you rush to that end goal and the process hasn't been established, your dog's got nothing to fall back on. There's no baseline, there's no systematic learning process, etc. And it can be complicated with buried targets. So I think people try and rush to get the end too quick, and even though it seems very basic in that, well, my dog can just do this and it's easy, that's what you're testing, and that's what you need the dogs to do as you progress through the process. So don't rush it. Take your time and ensure your dog understands clearly what it's supposed to be looking for. Build that confidence. Give it the tools it needs, like the all clear, etc., and an understanding of buried targets. And the other thing I preach is allow your dog to make mistakes. Don't, a mistake is a learning event. It's not a fault in the dog. It probably is a fault in your training, the way you've set it up. So we shouldn't correct a dog at any point during a detection exercise because we never want to make it a negative, particularly target odor, particularly in a complex type environment like a buried target. So allow the dog to make mistakes and understand, okay, I've made a mistake, but it's not a negative. I'm just going to be reset. The environment's going to be changed to help me win, and we go again. And I think if we allow our dogs to go into the environment with an understanding, clear understanding of its target odor, understanding of what its job is, how to do it, with confidence to do that job, and then not worried about making mistakes, then we're going to be a lot more successful. And generally, the biggest pitfalls, no, the biggest pitfalls are humans, without a shadow of a doubt. Whether that's rushing the dog, thinking the dog is better educated than it is at that point, and not giving the dogs the tools to be successful, not going at the dog's pace, not repeating the basics to ensure our dog clearly understands what's supposed to be happening. All the things that we talk about all the time in advanced dog training, they are the biggest pitfalls normally.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Oh, and here comes the puppy with a squeaker toy. Hey, Skipper. Buddy, you want to take that from me? Thank you. It's a favorite in the house right now. Thank you, buddy. I know. Lost my train of thought there. The humans. Oh, I guess one of the things I was thinking about with these foundations and getting those right. Just another plug for I am obsessed with having my interns right now. I've got three through Oregon State, and I've had each of them go through the same different foundation exercises. With some of the exercises, they're just doing it with one dog. So like one is working with Niffler, one is with Barley, and one is with Skipper. But it has been amazing to have my dogs go through those foundations with a second person a second time, or a third person a third time, and seeing how much then when I'm pulling the dogs out and working on really progressing their training, how much more solid they are because they've had somebody else going through, like I think Skipper has been through your imprinting workbook 3 times now with Kong. And it's making a really big difference because we're not just kind of just getting by, but he's actually really getting those foundations solidified over and over. And because they're interns and therefore they're following training plans and not making it up on the fly the way that I think intermediate trainers like to try to do, um, I think they're actually getting more of those tiny steps right, and not skipping.
Yeah, I
It's
think,
fantastic.
and I may be quoting this completely wrong. I think it was Ken Ramirez that said something like, and I can't remember the exact saying, um, new trainers will concentrate on the advanced work, but advanced trainers concentrate on the basics.
Yeah.
And I think that's very important, and even now, I mean, Poppy, she's what, 7.5, had over 10,000 confirmed fines under ice, underwater, on the hot beaches, is a solid, solid dog. And even though, she's probably one of the best dogs I've ever had the pleasure of working with, I still sniff on click on target odor more than any other part of the detection sequence because that nose to source is the most critical point. And I want to get that really ingrained in her, that getting your nose to source, or as close to source you can, is the most important thing. Not the sit, not the staring at it. Nothing else is as important as me being able to read the change of behavior and the nose goes to source. So I still do that more than anything else. And I think, again, when I tell people this, that you don't wait for a trained final response. No, because in real life, I don't always get a trained final response. In fact, in Kosovo, I had a dog called Thistle. He was an incredible Labrador. He was kind of a red yellow Labrador. And in all our field finds, our real life finds, never once did he give a trained final response. It was all on changing behavior. And, I'd read the change, say, okay, guys, you need to check this. And they would find something. And I think it's important that people understand the trained final response is nice in training and it's nice in social media, but in real life, it doesn't work like that. We have to learn about that changing behavior. So click on sniff is the biggest thing I do. And I'll even click during the change of behavior to follow the source, following the plume, etc., to reinforce that. Because the basics are so important. And that's more emphasized with the buried targets, I think. And I talk about click on sniff in the workbook, and actually part of the stages are just click on sniff, click on sniff. Don't worry about your train final response. That's nice, but it's not what you need to concentrate on at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm in the funny position now with my 12-year-old Barley of trying to move him back away from a trained final response. He's 12 and he's so ingrained to it, but particularly in some of our field situations in Alaska, last year I was noticing, buddy, I don't actually need you to go down and have to get back up. Um, he's perfectly physically capable of it. He's happy to do it, and he's so strong. And I don't want to make it sound like I'm working a dog who can't go into a down and come back up, but I am looking at where he's at and his understanding of the job. And, we're taking him out as a professor emeritus at this point, who just, he gets to go and show the young guys how it's done every so often. But I'm really like, no, you don't have to lie down anymore. Let's just work on click on sniff, because your understanding of target odor and your change of behavior, like, we read each other so well. And I'd actually prefer you not to do it anymore, because it's especially, I'm hoping that we're going to be able to continue playing this game recreationally until, the week before he dies. And he doesn't need to be going down into a full alert once that's really starting to get more physically challenging for him. Hopefully, still a couple of years away from that. But yeah. And then, Skipper, it's kind of the same thing. He's been doing this funny thing of he finds his odor, and then indoors he's really good about his alert, and then outdoors he squares up to me and stares at me and wags his tail. And it's like, yeah, that's perfect. There's nothing,
Yes.
it's very cute and there's nothing wrong with it. And as long as he stays put, that's really all I'm asking of him right now, is don't leave it again. So, do you have any success stories, any really cool finds you've had in the field that you'd like to tell us about as we're wrapping up here?
Oh, there's been so many, and
Yeah.
I'm fortunate that I have been in a lot of different situations all over, and in different environments, and had success with buried targets. Everything from the hot beaches in Texas, and obviously Pop has been hugely successful at finding tar balls buried under the beach in the hot sand, etc., all the way up to Canada. And in one case, my dog responded, and it had been following a spill and it had overwintered. So what had happened is a pipeline had leaked on a hill and the oil had run down the hill into a river. And it was near the end of survey season because winter was coming. So the next year we went back, and there'd been, 3 meters of ice and snow gone down the river, completely churned all this oil up. And my dog was going down the shoreline, and we're looking for remnants of the oil. And she started responding on a sandbank every 10 meters. And I would place a pin flag. She would go 10 meters, respond again, place a pin flag. And we went all the way around this sandbank, that was isolated a little from the river. And when the ecologists went in and started digging pits, they found that the whole sandbank was actually oil under about a foot of mud that had been washed over the top. And she'd gone round all the perimeter and delineated the perimeter of this huge mat. We've found everything from the huge mats like that all the way down to, if you follow my Instagram, poppies responded on the beach and we've dug up, and it's literally no more than a little finger of tarball several inches under the sand. So it's just constant everything, and in Laos with the scat that's been dragged underground by the dung beetles and the dogs have responded. And, you know, it's just so many examples of how this process has worked and how successful the dog's been. But, I fall back to the fact that I invest a lot of time in ensuring the dogs understand the training, and that's why they're so successful at what they do.
Yeah, yeah, that seems like the right note to end on. Well, Paul, where can people buy the book if they're interested at this point?
Yeah, so at the minute I have my own bookstore via my website. So if you go onto my website, chiron-k9.com, and about halfway down is a link to the actual bookstore,
Mhm.
and you can order it directly from there. And they have different locations where they publish it. Europe, USA, Australia, etc. And the nearest location will print on demand and mail it out to you. And actually, so the mailing is actually set at $5. So if you're somewhere strange like Finland, etc., buy it, I actually pay for the rest of the mailing, so it's not ridiculous amount of
Oh, that's
money for everyone. So you'll always just pay a $5 contribution to the mailing cost.
excellent. Yeah, and we'll make sure that we get that saved in the show notes if anybody is struggling to find it. If you're driving, don't get in a car crash trying to find it. Um, well, wonderful, Paul. Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun, and yeah, thank you for agreeing to come on and such short notice to talk about this. Yeah, as we said, we can find Paul at chironk9.com, and it's Chiron, it's Chiron. And yeah, for everybody at home, thank you so much for listening. And for those of you on YouTube, this is our first time posting one of these on YouTube. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned a lot and you're feeling inspired to get outside and be a canine conservationist in whatever way suits your passions and your skill set. Our podcast is edited by the wonderful Sarah Fangton. Our SciComm intern is Evelyn Combs. We've got a whole suite of volunteers that help get this podcast polished and published. We've got Brooke Schroeder, who helps with guest logistics. Meg DeBray helps with transcripts on the website. And Madison Davis, well, helps coordinate our group coaching calls, which you can join over on Patreon. You can find the show notes, donate K9 Conservationists, and keep up with us all at k9conservationists.org. Until next time, bye.